selling all of your apples, your gold per hour is actually really bad. Oh, I'm losing out on value per crop. You want to try and make as much gold as possible. Tons of data here, taking into account processing times. It's actually variable. Download it, copy it. You can actually grow more crops. This is an idea, theoretically, the best gold per tile. I kind of am introducing to the Palia gardening community. In February, I made a spreadsheet showcasing how much gold each crop makes per tile, but every time I suggest bok choy, everybody disagrees because of how long the seeding process takes and how terrible it is for gold per hour. But is it really? Well, this is that data, but if I showed you it right now, I don't think you'd appreciate all the effort that has gone into thinking about every little detail about the idea of gold per hour in Palia. So we'll get into that in a little bit, but first let's introduce what you'll be learning today. First, we'll cover the variables for this spreadsheet, then the math behind this craziness, and finally show you the chart and some interesting ways I found to visualize the data. This spreadsheet is more than just a static number to show which crops make the most gold per hour. This spreadsheet can be tailored to your exact specific situation with a few variables. First is the number of plant spaces you have. This is the number of squares you plan on using for a crop. For example, an entire field of carrots is 81 spaces, meanwhile the entire bok choy layout only uses 55 spaces. Next up is the number of crafters you plan on using. Maybe you're going all out for gold and plan on using all 30, or you're just beginning and only have space for 7. It's up to you. Playing hours, this one is kinda useless but has its purposes. Harvest boost is a toggleable option for whether or not your crops have the harvest boost applied to them. Sell raw crops is another toggleable option for whether or not to sell your raw crops. You'll see where this comes in later. Finally, Zeki seeds is whether or not you are making your own seeds or buying them from Zeki. Not super useful, but introduces an interesting concept later. For the math examples, we're going to use various crops of quality value and the seed maker as our default crafter. The math for regular quality values and the preserved values are the same concepts, but just slightly tweaked. Okay, so process time per crop is the time in minutes for a seed or preserve to craft one item, sometimes divided by the number of crops to make it. Number of plants on plot takes our variable plant spaces value and divides that by the plant size, after which rounding down to the nearest integer since we can't grow half a plant. Total crops grown checks to see if our harvest boost toggle is true. If so, it takes the number of plants on your plot and multiplies that by the crops grown per plant, and then multiplies that by 1.5 to give us our harvest boost. If the toggle is false, it just outputs the number of plants on the plot multiplied by the crops grown per plant. Crops processed per crafter first finds the amount of time it takes for the plant to completely grow in minutes. For bok choy, this is 180 minutes, and for apples, this is 1800 minutes. It then divides that time by the processing time per item to get how many crops one crafter can process in one grow cycle. Crafters needed takes our total crops grown number and divides it by the crops processed per crafter. So 81 spaces of apples only need 6.82 seed makers, whereas bok choy needs 97.2 seed makers to process the total crops grown within their grow cycle. Crops processed per grow cycle finally uses our variable for how many crafters we are using to see exactly how many crops are processed per cycle. This first checks if the crafters needed is higher than the number of crafters we plan to use, so we can find the limiting factor. If we don't have enough crafters, it multiplies the number of crafters we are using by the crops processed per crafter. If we have excess crafters and are limited by the number of crops grown, it instead multiplies the crops processed per crafter by the number of crafters needed. Initial harvest gold from processed crops is the first column with a formula that looks absolutely crazy at first glance. It starts very similar to crops processed per grow cycle by checking for a limiting factor of processed crops versus number of crops grown. It calculates processed crops by taking the total grow days for a crop and subtracting the days to initial harvest, and then multiplying that by 60 to get it into minutes. We remove the initial harvest days because you can't process crops until the first set is grown. That is then divided by the process time per crop and multiplied by the number of crafters we're using, rounded down to the nearest integer. This gets compared to the number of harvests minus 1 divided by the number of harvests and multiplied by the total crops grown. Since we can't process crops grown in the last harvest, this keeps the data comparable. If the number of crops grown is the limiting factor, it takes the same percentage of crops grown and multiplies this by the seeds per crop and seed value. If the number of crafters is the limiting factor, then we take the same time remaining after initial harvest and divide this by the process time per crop. This is then multiplied by the number of seeds per crop and the number of crafters we are using. After rounding down to the nearest integer, we multiply this by the seed value. Initial harvest gold from raw crops takes the number of crops that weren't processed during the initial harvest time and sells them for a regular price. The formula first checks to see if the sell raw crops option is toggled. If it isn't, the column is hidden and counted as a 0. If the toggle is on, we first do the same check as the initial harvest process crops. If the crops grown is the limiting factor, we take total crops grown minus the crops grown in the first 3 harvests to simply find the crops harvested in the final batch and multiplies that by the crop's raw selling value. If the crops processed is the limiting factor, same thing, total crops grown minus crops processed, multiplying that by the raw selling value. Constant harvest gold from processed crops is really simple compared to the rest, as this takes data from previously made columns. This one simply takes the crops processed per grow cycle and multiplies it by the number of seeds produced and their value. Constant harvest gold from raw crops is also much simpler than the initial harvest crops. Since this technically takes place after the crops have grown, we don't check for a limiter. The number of crops processed is either maxed out or limited by time. Because of this, we only take the total crops grown minus the crops processed per grow cycle and multiply that by the raw selling value. We again check to see if the sell raw crops toggle is on or off. If it's off, we hide the number and make it a 0. Lost replant value ended up a little bit more complex than I originally intended because of the need to check against 2 variables. So I built this to first check if we are using Zeki seeds or our own to replant. This takes us down 2 identical paths with the exception of seed prices. We then check if the sell raw crops toggle is on. If yes, it is simply the number of plants on plot times the seed value. If we are not selling the raw crops, we use the number of crops processed per grow cycle and divide that by the total crops grown. This gives us a percentage which we can then multiply by the number of plants on our plot, rounding up to the nearest integer to find out how many plants we are truly harvesting each cycle and only account for the replant value of those crops. Finally, this is multiplied by the seed value. Processed profit per day is our final column to calculate and looks way more complicated than it really is because of the requirement to hide it. But the real math in the column is pretty simple. We take 1 copy of both values from the initial harvest, we take the values of the constant harvest and multiply that by the number of harvests minus 1, and finally we take the number of harvests and multiply that by the replant costs. We add the initial values to the constant values, subtracting the replant costs, and divide everything by the playing hours. If this value is less than 1, it is hidden. If you are interested in checking out the data for yourself and experimenting with your own variables to see which crop works best for you, you'll find it all at aqajj.net/palia-notes. There you'll find the link to the spreadsheet as well as some notes about sharing images and data from the spreadsheet. Also, while you're there, feel free to scroll down and pick up the free Hot Pot printable cards that you can play with your friends in real life. Alrighty, so welcome. This is the entire dashboard I have built for all of this data now. Let's go over what all these different charts mean and then we'll go mess around with some of the data. On top here, we have the theoretical maximum of gold per tile. This is not accounting for processing time, so this is using an infinite number of crafters and basically comes down to playing hours. So you could run, you could harvest your bok choy in 3 hours, let it run for 12 hours in the cedars overnight, and then log on for like 10 minutes, let it run for another 12 hours, and basically in 3.5 hours, you would basically make 6,000 gold. So you basically almost get to this theoretical maximum. Down here in the middle is our new chart. This is real gold per hour down to like taking into account processing times and grow periods and harvesting consistently and playing like 24/7. This is going to be the minimum amount of gold you're going to make per tile per hour. I've added a new key. You get green for good, yellow for mid, red for bad, and formatted the exact same way as our previous video, all the crops going across the rows and selling methods going down the columns. Maybe you are not a numbers person and you'd rather see this in text form. I've got each column sorted by itself in a nice little chart here so you can take a look at each little individual column. Maybe if you're someone who goes in the Discord and says, what is the best preserves to sell? You don't care about what's the best overall, just what is the best preserves. You can now see that you've got only preserves compared here, and you can take a look there and if you're not a numbers person. Over here we have these other charts, these are graphs, another way to visualize all this data if you're not a numbers person. You'll see that starting out here at the bottom, gold per hour is not just a static number, it's actually variable based on how many days you play. So you'll see here that whenever you play for like 1 or 2 or 3 harvests, your gold per hour is actually really, really bad. And as you continue to play, you keep adding on more and more gold per hour, and you keep making your average go up. It approaches the limit faster if you sell raw crops, but we'll get into that a little bit later. But gold per hour does range based on how many days you are playing. And finally, one of the most interesting ways to visualize this data in terms of minimum gold per hour and maximum gold per hour is this candlestick chart here. We have it sorted out by seeds and preserves. The bottom of this blue line is the minimum gold per hour. That's going to be your actual true gold per hour rate. And the top of the line is going to be your theoretical max. So the less that you play, the higher up you are on this blue bar. The longer the blue bar, the bigger the potential energy that you have or potential gold that you can make. If you're like carrots here and your bar is like really, really thin, almost a sliver, that means that even if you're playing 24/7, you're going to hit that theoretical max really quick because you're able to process pretty much all of the crops within the time it takes to grow all of your carrots. So the bigger the line, the more potential you have, the smaller it is, the smaller the potential, or the closer you are to your maximum. Now, if you sell your raw crops as well, this also changes it. And it's also interesting to note that on some of these, like bok choy, the minimum gold you can make by selling your raw crops is actually better than the theoretical maximum of selling all of your apples and playing for less time. So a very interesting way to see if, if the minimum of a crop is better than the maximum. So again, very interesting things you can use with this preserve min and maximums. So let's jump into actually comparing some of the data here. You're going to go ahead and mess around with any number of plant spaces, and it will change this graph completely. You can have 27 if you're just like a new player, and maybe you've only got 6 seeders. You can tailor this to your exact situation. It'll tell you which one's better, seeds or preserves, or if you're like Napa cabbage, always the same straight across the board, never changes, which is actually really impressive that they managed to make it that way. But you can have it whatever. Maybe you have all 9 plots, but you don't have a whole lot of seeders or crafters. You can go ahead and see which selling method is best for you. Again, 100% tailored to your custom situation, minus the ability to choose how many hours you're playing per day. But just figure if you're playing less, you're higher up on that blue chart. Playing hours doesn't really have much of a significance unless you're not selling the raw crops. You can see this over here. But it doesn't really have a whole bunch of effect of really changing the different outcomes. It kind of just smushes them together or pulls them apart. But if you want to see the absolute like maximum mathematical limit, you'll see that you can approach that by going to like 100 million or something like that. But I usually keep it in like a regular range, something small, so the computer doesn't have to do as much work. Around 1,000, 300. Let's turn back on sell raw crops. Now, what is sell raw crops, you might be asking? This is an idea that I kind of am introducing to the Palia gardening community of, instead of comparing just the amount of crops you're processing in a certain time, so apples, you can process pretty much all of your crops. Carrots, process all of your crops. But bok choy, you cannot process all of your crops, right? Let's get you actually showing it on the chart here. Bok choy ends up being really, really bad because you only process a fraction of your bok choy into seeds, despite it being theoretically the best gold per tile. So I wanted to introduce the idea of comparing the entire harvest of one crop to the entire harvest of another crop. So even if you max out your seeders, what if you sell your crops? Now, a lot of people have a hard time with this because it's like, oh, I'm losing out on value per crop. But if you run a little bit lower margins, you can actually grow more crops and actually, push out more money per hour if you sell your raw crops. And you can see this happen right here. When we sell raw crops, the graph like completely flips. So instead of just comparing a portion of each, and it's not really comparable, let's compare the entire crop harvest of whatever you want to the entire crop harvest of the other. And what really is interesting about this data is that bok choy preserves are number 1 and bok choy seeds are number 2. And that's because bok choy itself just sells for a way higher price than any other crop. Bok choy itself almost beats out apple preserves, which is really, really interesting. So, you might only be seeding a fraction of your crops, but if you let those seeders run overnight, you're actually going to get closer to that theoretical maximum. So if you're looking for the ideal, now this changes, play around with your own variables and data and see what works for you. But if you're going to go for best gold per hour, I'm thinking that it actually is bok choy seeds. You throw everything in the seeder, whatever you can't put in there, put in the shipping bin, sell all that. And because the bok choy seeds take forever to process, you're not going to run out of crops to process overnight. You're going to get closer to that theoretical limit whenever you're not playing. And even when you are playing 24/7, bok choy seeds, the second best crop you can grow with, like, you know, if you're really going to go for gold. Maybe you only have like 7 days left for the Manji market. You want to try and make as much gold as possible. It doesn't matter if you're selling stuff for, you know, a low margin. Let's just push out gold and try and make as much gold per hour. So very interesting. And then finally, we have Zeki seeds. This is an interesting idea, something for you to play around with. You know, if you have 30 preserve jars, you need to actually have somewhere to get seeds. So 30 preserve jars and buying seeds from Zeki can sometimes, by a slim margin, like a very small percentage, actually be better than taking away some of your preserve jars to make your own seeds. You know, you're costing yourself some profits. They're pretty much even, but it's an interesting thing if you really want to try and find those minute details, if you're like me and, you know, are looking for all the little tiny gems out there. So yeah, this is completely reactive to your own data set. Go ahead and mess around with all of this. Download it, copy it, move these to your own individual charts at the bottom so they're much bigger if you want to get a bigger look at them. And just play around with this. Now whenever someone's in the Discord and they ask, oh, you know, what's the best crop to grow? I've got all 9 plots, but I've only got 7 seeders. Throw them this spreadsheet and let them figure it out for themselves and type in their own numbers and mess around with stuff. Or maybe you type it in for them and just give them the answer. But tons of data here, tons of dashboard views. It's really, really cool. Now, I do know that I rag on apple seeds and apple preserves a lot because bok choy almost beats it by not doing any extra work. But apple seeds do have a secret.